Hey everyone, Patrick Bryan here from the Cape Fear Collective. Welcome to this overview webinar. We're going to walk you through a little bit about the origin story of Cape Fear Collective, talk about the collective impact methodology, and just kind of give a primer for some of the things that we're looking to do and some of the future initiatives we're hoping to support through this community collaborative process. This all really started out kind of post-Hurricane Florence when a lot of nonprofits, corporate actors, the government all started to kind of come together around supporting folks who had been affected by the hurricane. And of course, this community had been exercising collective impact muscles for years and years, through the United Way and through various coalitions and initiatives to address certain social issues. And so this wasn't necessarily something new, but really kind of galvanized around this historic hurricane event. We started to see conversations kind of change within the community about what would be next. And so from a funding standpoint, organizations like Encino and Live Oak Bank started to talk about what would it take to stand up a backbone organization that could support all the amazing work going on in our community, and really focusing on some things that are hard to scale and hard to invest in if you're an individual nonprofit. Data science, policy and advocacy, taking a look at how we approach media and storytelling as a result of that data collection, and really speak to the lived experience. And then also, how do you provide a project management infrastructure that allows hundreds of organizations to kind of work towards a common goal? And so this entire process really started kind of mid last year in 2019 with a very extensive listening tour that continues today, and will probably continue for the duration of the initiative and of the organization and beyond. And out of that came four key observations. So I think the first observation was really around the amazing work already going on in the county. Making the rounds over coffee and lunch, and really starting to get to know some of the community leaders here in Wilmington and New Hanover County. It was clear from the get-go that we had the resources in place to really move the needle, and had moved the needle in multiple historic initiatives over the last few years. But again, with the hurricane and with just the advancement of knowledge and expertise in nonprofit and social sector leadership, I think that there is a hunger to kind of up the game and up the ante a little bit. And so we started to take a look at this, and we're trying to understand, what's the feasibility of deploying collective impact methodology at scale, and what it's, in answering that question, we've kind of taken a step back and we said, listen, there are a few things that we think we can do well, and we can do them well at scale. So instead of trying to jump into a backbone role, again, we'll get into backbone organizations here shortly when we start to talk about collective impact, we kind of started looking at ourselves as a backbone of backbones. So really thinking hard about how can we kind of, from the back of the room, leverage the resources and kind of the aggregate ability of the entire community to drive towards specific community initiatives. And so could we expand upon resources, expand upon fundraising? Could we work through the connective tissue between all of these organizations and really try to build a system to fight a system? And we through that model, could we really leverage every nonprofit, both large and small, both the church and the individual volunteer across the board, in order to actually drive social progress? And so we've kind of postured ourselves in that way, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we think that looks like here shortly. The second observation was that resources are low and the need is great. And if you're on the front lines of the social sector here in the county, you know this. And if you're a funder, you know this. And probably a lot of citizens and folks involved in this sector have seen it as well. But we really wanted to get to the root of what this meant. Again, I'd heard it a lot. I could kind of see it in the faces of folks that we talked to who are really doing a heck of a lot of work with not a lot of resource to back them, and we're really working every day to ease the suffering of citizens and patients and clients and communities, but we're really trying to be scrappy around how they allocated funding and what they could do to scale. And so we dove into this a little bit with the help of Dr. Chris Prentice from UNCW, and we started to take a hard look at the numbers. So what we found essentially is that statement is true. So first of all, the resources are low. The first thing that the myth that we dispelled, though, is that there's too many nonprofits in New Hanover County, and that's just currently not true. When we adjust that first line there, that 501c3s per 10,000 citizens, so we adjust for population, what we find is that there really is, we're kind of in the ballpark in terms of our comparison counties, in terms of how many nonprofits do exist today. Now, the total count is somewhere around 1,100. Every time we talk about that number, people are always a little bit blown away by it. But that being said, a good chunk of those may not be active. And in addition to that, when you look around and you're like, wow, there's still a significant need here, even with all these nonprofits, I think for us, we started to, instead of thinking about how can we lean out, more so how could I leverage every single nonprofit to be precise about where they interact on this patient care continuum or the student care continuum, and really start to leverage resources that have been under leveraged just due to communication or data sharing or the ability to storytell around the lived experience of the folks we're trying to help. So once we kind of get through that, if you take a look at the bottom two lines, we talk about total assets, again, per capita and total program revenue. For New Hanover County, for every person that lives here, there's about $1,300 or so in program revenue by nonprofits through donations, through grants, through other revenue streams. But when you compare that to Buncombe County, we're in Nashville, or Forsyth County, you can see there's a stark contrast between the amount of donations and 501c3 revenue that are here in this region and some of our comparison cities. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, but what it certainly means is that nonprofits here are usually underfunded, and they're not necessarily able to meet the need that they're seeing in the community. And so we also bump this up against the need. And so when you take a look at this, what you can see is that we're under-resourced, but at the same time, we really struggle and actually have, in some cases, far worse issues than those counties in North Carolina that have far more funding than us. Particularly when it comes to housing, we are really at a detriment there, and in terms of standard poverty statistics and income inequality, we're right in this pretty rough ballpark of really having some significant issues around disparity. And so again, when we look at this data, we really think, to my point earlier, how can we leverage everything in this community, the existing resources, to be more effective? But then two, we need to go out and get additional revenue sources, additional funding streams into this community in order to kind of bump that $1,300 per capita up so that we can start to move away from this upward trend line. When you take a look at this over time, what you see is that in 2000, there was about 20,000 folks living below the poverty line, and since then, the 2017 numbers, the number was somewhere between 35 and 45,000 people living below the poverty line. So the problems are not getting better. Where it's not like we're doing more with less per se at a population health level. The nonprofits certainly are at an individual organization level. But if we don't put a stopgap soon through operational infrastructure, through additional data to gain operational efficiency, and be able to go out and pitch grants at the national level, we're going to continue to see this disparity gap widen. The third observation is really about actionable data. And globally, you've seen this revolution in data science and technology, particularly in the corporate and the private sector. Leaps and bounds are being made in the ability to predict consumer behavior and the ability to mine large data sets, and that's really shown a ton of profits in that sector over the last few years. And the social impact sector and the nonprofit sector, we're still trying to catch up with that revolution. And so you're seeing, major funders like the Rockefeller Foundation invest heavily in new data science initiatives for nonprofits. We're seeing this kind of be really churn itself up to the awareness of major global leaders that data science is going to be the future of social impact, that we can do our jobs far more efficiently and far more effectively if we have access to the same tools that are commonly used in the corporate sector. So we've taken a hard look at this and tried to think about how can we scale at this local, hyper-local level some of these advances in technology. Now there is some really some great data visualizations out there, right? So if you haven't checked out Opportunity Atlas yet, I really encourage you to do so. It does some great work and provides some great insights at the census tract level. But take a look at the left-hand side here, right? Median rent, 2016 data. Job growth rates, 2013 data. So we have the exact metrics we want to take a look at. It's publicly available data. It's aggregated at the census tract level, but it's 4 years or 7 years old. So if I'm trying to fail fast using that data, or I'm trying to assess if my program's being effective, pretty hard to do that, just given this publicly available data as it's presented on its website. Same thing with some of the local assessments that we do, right? The community health assessment is a great tool, but it's only done every 3 years. And so how can we take something like that and try to make it a yearly process? And public health leaders across the county and the region are eager for that, right? But it's resource intensive, and it does take up a lot of time. So how can we build an infrastructure that allows us to kind of iterate on that and do that a lot more easily? Same thing with state level data, right? This is some data from the North Carolina Early Childhood Action Plan around food insecurity. Really, again, great data, great insight, but 2016 data. So how can we take this and move it forward and get it more hyper-local and hyper-current? City Health Dashboard is another great resource if you want to check that out. This is a graph of premature deaths for all causes. And again, great data, but 2017. So we know that the hospital has this data. Can we partner with them to have it a more updated focus so that we can get that data sooner and we can aggregate that data and then we can act on that data as fast as possible? This conversation between equality and equity is really critical, we feel. Equality really assumes that people start from the same place, same history, the same set of circumstances, and we know, and the data really shows that there has been very systemic marginalizations of certain populations because of their race, because of their socioeconomic status, because of their beliefs. And so recognizing this fact, this history, this narrative, this lived experience for a lot of folks, we really think that the focus should be on equity and understanding that some folks need a little bit higher step to get over that wall, to get over that barrier. They need a little bit more wraparound support, not for a lack of desire or motivation or ability, but because there is a system at place that has held them back from being the best version of themselves and the best version of their community. And so we look at this all the time. We talk about this all the time. It's a real mainstay in terms of how we plan operationally and strategically, and also how we will end up kind of looking at things like data and storytelling. Are we doing it through an equity lens? And so we think that if you're focused on, the 20 or 25% or 30% of the most marginalized citizens among us, you're going to have the greatest impact, and you are going to take the greatest step towards a more just world, a more equitable world, a more prosperous and healthy community that really sets conditions for success for all people. So the current assessment, all right, so based on those 4 observations, minimal funding across a large number of nonprofit actors. That doesn't mean that there's too many nonprofit actors. We're just saying that, the resources are scarce for the number of nonprofits we have. But it creates a fragmented, inefficient system because those nonprofits just don't have what they need to get the job done. That being said, if a large influx of investment did occur, it would be challenging to allocate the funding based on outcomes, something like a 3rd grade reading level or a disease prevalence across such a large systemic sector that's already currently under-resourced. So you have to have a mechanism for that funding flow through and just being able to kind of convene that many actors in a way that is productive, and as well as match the data up with such a way that allows us to kind of see where we're working well and where we're not, what programs are having effect and which are not, etc. And based on that as well, we know that this region is going to require a more holistic and aggressive fundraising approach. And at the same time, we have to leverage existing value. So we have to find several $1 million in resources right here in the county already by operational improvement, by better communication, really focusing on how we work together with one another to amplify each of our impacts. And then with that organization and with that movement, really go out to the national scene and say, hey, something special is happening here in southeastern North Carolina. And those funders want to be a part of those things, but what they're looking for is that cohesiveness, that coalition. They're looking for that data. They're really trying to look for evidence-based methodologies at the population health level, the community building level. And so a focus on that is going to give us the attention that we need to really expand. And then finally, that data-driven systems approach. You've heard this woven throughout some of the things I've talked about so far, but we need to fail fast. Having data not only unlocks better health outcomes and better education outcomes, it also unlocks better funding outcomes. It allows us to show value to our donors. It allows us to show value to government entities who might be making grants, et cetera. So this is kind of where we kind of summed up some of these observations and some of this journey so far. And so with that, all that being said, where does collective impact play a role? How is that a solution potentially to some of the issues that we've already described? So let's start with what is collective impact. Simply put, it brings people together in a structured way to achieve social change. This is a methodology that's been around a long time. A lot of folks have done it in years past without necessarily calling it a collective impact. But it really came on the scene about 10 years ago through an article in the Stanford Innovation Review where folks started to kind of put a doctrine around cohesiveness and systems thinking as it pertains to social impact. And really what the methodology does is allow us to layer on the hundreds of organizations and actors across the county or across a region who are all working to build a better community just in their own sector, their own way, their own swim lane. And by doing so, what you have is a much more cohesive movement moving forward, but you also have a much more effective movement where you're really leveraging kind of every asset that you have at your disposal. And so what it ends up doing is taking you kind of from the left to the right. And what we see in most nonprofit sectors, I've done this work all over the world, where you usually see is the individual impact in isolation, and you see coordinated impact with alignment. And so, again, there's impact being made, there's great work occurring, but what you're trying to do is push towards the right side of this graph. You're trying to get to more of a collective impact with more of a collaborative action, continuous learning, shared cohesion, etc., so that you can really make generational change versus individual community or people change. So we're trying to kind of take the sum of the parts that represent our community, and we're trying to drive towards that North Star, whether that's a healthier community, a prosperous community, an equitable community, and make sure that everyone is leveraging their unique expertise and skill set and experience, whether that be a citizen or a nonprofit leader or a hospital leader or a political leader, to get us to a better tomorrow. So let's talk about the 5 conditions of collective impact. The first one is common agenda. So this is really kind of that first step. What problem are we trying to solve? And what do we feel is the best solution or solutions to deploy in order to solve it? And so at first this seems like kind of an easy step, but when you get into the systemic nature of social impact work, things like cradle to career and public health, this is actually a really complicated and must be a very deliberate process to get to this common agenda. You have to bring together a diverse set of actors. You have to make sure you're incorporating communities and citizens and understanding their perception of the reality that you're trying to shape in a positive way. You really have to spend the time and have the hard conversations around this in order to kind of solidify that agenda so that everyone, and I'm talking hundreds of actors here, everyone understands this is the direction we're going and this is the agenda that we have, not over 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but for generations. It's not about constructing a way of doing things as much as it is constructing a way of being, a way of operating day to day, this new reality around this common agenda. Once you have that common agenda, you're going to have to iterate a lot. In order to iterate, in order to adapt and pivot as you need to, you're going to do a lot of kind of hypothesis testing and trying new things and new programs to affect this problem you're trying to address. But shared measurement system becomes so critical, and really understanding what are the key data points and metrics you're trying to move, and what are the key indicators, based on this really rich availability of data that allows you to adjust programming as needed. Once you have that agenda, you have that shared measurement piece, you get into 3 and 4, mutually reinforcing activities and continuous communication. And the way I think about these two is really around this idea of a shared consciousness. It's everyone understanding where they fit in the ecosystem and then actively seeking out additional relationships and connections and kind of all working off the same playbook, off the same updates, off the same data, so that everyone's kind of working in lockstep and working with the same core set of values, the same core set of measurement and that common agenda. In order to kind of make 1 through 4 run, the successful organizations, and we talked about a little about this earlier, successful initiatives like this harness the power of a backbone organization. So everyone participating in this collaborative approach, they have day jobs, right? They're kind of feeding hungry kids. They're working on tutoring programs. They're providing clinical care in a hospital environment. Someone has to continually be thinking about the connective tissue between the organizations and the initiative as a whole, day in and day out. And that's where the backbone organization comes in, supporting with resources and with staff, the project management, the communication, the meetings and convening facilitation, grant writing and data science support, all that stuff that's required to make this very large machine drive forward in a way that is consistent, is really all-encompassing and population-focused, but at the same time nimble enough to make the adjustments required in order to fail fast and to really have an effect. So what are some examples of this work around the country? So Population Health Collaborative is a good example of something that's really public health focused, doing some amazing work up in Buffalo, New York around diabetes prevention and transportation and community planning. They also had a really innovative program around putting healthy foods in corner stores in the inner city. So really kind of solving a food desert problem with existing assets and really making sure that folks where they shop already have access to healthy food. Another one that's pretty well known is the Spartanburg academic movement in Spartanburg, South Carolina. 7 school districts really focused on cradle to the career continuum, so kindergarten readiness and early grade reading, math, high school graduation and attainment. They've been doing this work for a while and are pretty established and really focused on that classroom and some of the wraparound support through summer reading programs, after school programs, etc., across a pretty wide network. Rapid City Collective Impact is in South Dakota. Really interesting organization. They do affordable housing and food insecurity, but they also have a very strong tribal and racial equity programming, really focused around how are we supporting folks on the reservations, how are we healing and talking about some of these equity issues while still providing services to promote poverty alleviation. So I want to talk a little bit about this cradle to career example. We're going to use this to talk you through kind of what this actually looks like in practice, right? You've kind of heard me talk about some of our observations, and here's this theory called collective impact. What does it actually end up looking like? So Spartanburg academic movement, Forsyth Promise up in North Carolina in the Triad, Roadmap project out in Seattle. These are some examples. There's several others across the nation, but they really take these evidence-based metrics that we know really matter in a person's life, and they lay them out on this continuum. So when we say cradle to career, starting in the cradle, prenatal health, right at birth, all the way through, your job placement, probably multiple job placements over the course of your lifetime, education, attainment, etc. You start to lay out all these key data points, all these key North Stars that multiple organizations would fall under this umbrella in order to drive these impact metrics. So prenatal health, pre-K access, kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, high school retention, high school graduation, post-secondary attainment, and job placement. This is attacking the full spectrum across a child's life and an adult's life to ensure that we are all aligned on the same kind of focus around prosperity. And really, if you think about this like a leaky faucet, right? We lose kids because they have no access to quality pre-K, right? So how do we solve that problem? How do we fill that gap, right? In 3rd grade, this is when a child goes from learning to read to reading to learn. That's a critical moment for that child. We know that if they read at grade level in 3rd grade, their outcomes, chances down the line for high school graduation increase exponentially. So how are we addressing that leak if there is one, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of where we start. This is the spine, this is the continuum, this is kind of the foundation around which we build. If we choose this as that initiative, or if we choose this method of organizing, this is where we start. So what does that look like in practice? So at the top, right, same continuum, same key metrics. So we start to take a look at New Hanover County. How do we organize around this? And again, this is an example, and these are all organizations from one of our last community partners meetings. just to give you a sense and a flavor and talk you through how this might actually turn out in application. So one, you need the school district, right? Special needs schools, various charter schools like GLOW. You need those in place, right? This is a core part of what you're trying to achieve here through child development and education. And then organizations like the United Way, who are major local funders who really focus on children and families, really getting into the mix around being a champion for this cause and then funding gaps in programming and different experimental programs to see what works and what doesn't. There's a lot of roles for them in that space, as well as additional assets like community foundations. You can imagine corporate funders being involved in that space as well. And so you've got the education piece in a standard pipeline. Now you've got something like a Smart Start, who's really focused on the first 2,000 days and working with parents and kind of working that 0 to 5 pipeline. And then you have organizations like Community Conversations that are kind of pushing equitable conversations in the school districts and different types of education settings, making sure that we're really being equitable around making sure kids from all neighborhoods and all racial backgrounds and all socioeconomic backgrounds have what they need to flourish and to learn and to go to the next level. And you've got after school programs, right? Dreams or Community in Schools. Those kids are only in those schools from 7:30 to 2:30 or 7:30 to 3. Where do they go next? How are those organizations and those programs supporting their 3rd grade reading? How are they supporting their 8th grade math? How are those programs driving to a better high school retention rate? They play critical roles in this. Housing, right? A kid's not going to learn if they don't have proper housing. So housing authority, Cape Fear Habitat for Humanity, right? Even the private real estate sector has a role to play here. And again, you can kind of see where if you were to look at that spine and that continuum, you're thinking, oh, education, right? And if you were going to maybe write a grant on that, you would think, oh, I'm going to write an education grant. But we know that housing has a critical role to play in, a kid being ready for 3rd grade or 8th grade or high school. And so they have a real seat at the table. And now also they have an opportunity to be wrapped into some of these larger funding packages to really support wraparound services. Kid needs to be healthy, right? So you have all these different health organizations, many of them large anchor institutions here and across the region. And so how are we involving the public health sector and ensuring that, again, something like a 3rd grade reading level is achieved? If that child is not healthy, that child is not going to read at grade level or not going to be proficient in 8th grade math, we're going to start seeing the leaks of these faucets at these key metrics kind of happen more and more if we're not thinking about those angles. Likewise, something that a lot of folks don't think about, but which you see a lot globally is, what about environmental health? We're seeing this now with some of the kind of reemergence of PFAS and kind of the conversations in Brunswick County and here in New Hanover County. But we know that kids need a healthy environment in which to live. Their water needs to be clean. We know that climate change and various environmental ailments affect the poorest and most marginalized populations across the world. There is a way to make sure that these elements are totally synced up with what we're trying to do in child development pipelines. Also, we know that we're seeing a lot of economic growth in things like clean energy. So how are we also wrapping up exposure to things like sustainable agriculture, solar energy, kind of preparing kids in a workforce development way to have interest in a future in these fields that are rapidly growing. In 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there'll be a plentiful jobs in this sector. So we should be really mindful of that kind of key intersection as well. We get that child through that continuum, get them to high school graduation. We have to start talking about post-secondary attainment. Now that might be a trade school, it could be a job right out of high school, but community college, UNCW, how are they playing a role? How are they getting involved in this conversation? Because sooner or later, the kids that are in kindergarten have a real potential to be in their institutions downstream, and they want the best graduates possible as well. So how are they leaning into high schools and middle schools and getting folks prepared for that attainment and understanding even, hey, you can go through our lineman program with Duke Energy, or hey, we have this coding boot camp. How are they kind of interacting with the greater system to make sure that, again, this continuum is successful? And then, getting down to the career side of the cradle to career, you've got organizations like the corporate communities who really both from a standpoint of wanting to hire folks out of these local regions and grow their business and attract new businesses, but also to ensure that the folks they do hire have quality schools and quality child outcomes for their kids. The corporate sector is heavily invested, or should be heavily invested, in this type of work. Additionally, you have organizations like Link and Cape Fear Literacy Council, who are doing amazing work with adults, young adults, old adults, really trying to harness wraparound services and support, even if after that kind of career sector ends, right? So we go through multiple kind of sunrises and sunsets across our adult life, and things go up and down. Who's supporting those folks? A lot of those folks end up being parents, they end up being mentors, and so we want to make sure that they're supported as well, because we know, again, downstream, if mom and dad have good jobs, if mom and dad have a roof over their head, if they're able to be successful, they're very likely to have very successful children, and children who feel cared for and have conditions set up for them to be successful. So, this is kind of an example of how this would lay out. And then what you start to do is start to work these information and data dials, right? So now everyone is working together. They're all driving towards this agreed upon continuum set of metrics. And now you might have, let's say, New Hanover County Schools is looking at something like third grade reading, where Dreams and Community in Schools are looking at their kind of near-term program outcomes for their after-school programming that aligns with New Hanover County's third grade reading levels, which aligns with that student's success rate, right? So you start to build a bit of a data pyramid, in which everyone is kind of focused on the same, more or less, the same metrics they've always have been, but now with a much greater understanding of how their metrics affect the broader metrics, and far more accessibility around, if I'm doing a program around kindergarten readiness, that might be a critical component to 8th grade math. And so really showing value and showing a cohesiveness and connectedness across that spectrum and between organizations. So we say connective tissue, and being concerned about that and being focused on that from the Cape Fear Collective side. That's really what we're talking about, is how do you take all these organizations and make sure that they're meshed in a way that really drives progress forward along a set continuum of metrics. So now we kind of transition over to the data side. So this is a STUML diagram, and so this is, very, at first, you're kind of like, what is this thing? But kind of bear with me here, right? So a STUML diagram basically talks about time and space, all right? And so you can imagine time and impact, right? Space being the number of folks served, the level of impact that they're able to achieve through programming, etc. And what you start to see is boxes and circles lay themselves out over this very highly predictable trajectory, right? And so you have molecular processes occur that goes to bottle incubations, it goes up to phytoplankton, and again, these are a sequence of events across time and space that then start to drive to a final outcome. Around at the far top right, you have coupled marine ecosystem models, right? So I'm going to show you a much easier one, but I wanted to highlight and keep in mind on the next slide that when you start to build these out, you start to get to a really interesting place around predictability, which then backs you into some really great evidence-based practices that really affect change. All right, so slide 2. This one's a little easier to digest, but take a look at this. This is essentially, it's talking about forest fires and kind of re-entry of various animals and plants into that ecosystem once that fire has occurred. And so you can see here again, time and space, time and area in this case. You have basically starting from left to right. You have a burn, right? And then you have the impact of forest fires, right? The impact around topography and soil conditions and fuel conditions. You have this safe period for controlled burning, which is very finite. And eventually, as that occurs, you get to things like good hunting areas with recent burn. You have plant and ecology kind of reintroducing itself. And then in the far right, you have these caribou returning to an area following fire. So really what we're looking at here is kind of burn happens at the kind of intersection of the axes, and then it takes 100 years after that occurring for those caribou to come back into that ecosystem. And so how does this translate? Again, this really shows how we lay out data. So I'll give you an example. All right, so again, same type of diagram. You have time and you have impact. So let's take a look at this, right? So pre-K access. We measure pre-K access. Say tomorrow we decide as a community we're going to go after pre-K. So we go out there and we start increasing the access of quality pre-K across the county. That is a near-term target and has a very significant impact. The downstream effect of that is kindergarten readiness. So if we had done this differently, right, and we said, well, we want to see numbers move right now in kindergarten readiness, and as a function of that, we were just measuring kindergarten readiness and not taking a look at how we're addressing pre-K access, that initiative would probably fail, right? Because we're not showing the precise time and space or the time and impact measurements for the right interventions at the right time. So another example, right? If we're able to affect reliable transportation, potentially we could see an increase in enrollment in job training, which downstream over time may show an increase in median family income. Same thing, right? Third grade reading proficiency could affect high school graduation rates. Now, my point with all these very confusing diagrams is this. Oftentimes, nonprofit sectors tend to come out with the 5-year plan to increase high school graduation rates. And oftentimes we struggle because we don't see an increase in those rates. We don't see positive outcomes are affected in that length of time. And so what we often find ourselves doing is we're not measuring the right things at the right times in the right impact spaces. And so a lot of what we talk about in collective impact when we're coming back from these data pyramids, etc., we're saying, hey, we know we want to get to a high school graduation rate, but we know that based on the resources available and based on the current issues we're facing, that high school graduation rate may not shift for 10 years. But what will shift in the near term if we do XYZ programming is that increase in third grade reading proficiency. And so it's, again, the North Star in this case, in this example, is high school graduation rates, but we're focused on increasing third grade reading proficiency in the near term because we know downstream that high school graduation rate should move. And so we don't want to set ourselves up for failure, but rather would want to set up a kind of causal mechanism like this where we're saying, let's be precise about when and which outcomes we're measuring and know the sequence of those outcomes over time. And so that's kind of where the data starts to play itself out. All right, so we've walked you through some observations, the collective impact methodology, kind of worked through some of the organizational and data elements and how that might play out using Cradle to Career as an example. So what's next? What is next for Cape Fear Collective and how are we trying to push this work forward? So the first element is we want to go out and get the data. So when I talked about those metrics earlier and having data that's actionable, we're really trying to lean into that process. And so what we've essentially done is taken a look at a list of about 300 health and economic opportunity metrics. We're trying to get that list of metrics down to about 50 or 75 as a starting point. We're doing that 3 different ways. The first is using the academic community at UNCW, who's leaning into that in an academic-based approach. 2 is looking at our partners, whether it be nonprofits, corporate organizations, higher education, etc., and really seeing what are the metrics that they want to see, what are the metrics they feel affects them the most. And then thirdly, we're going to have meetings with community members and community forums and saying, hey, through your lived experience, which ones of these metrics really speak to you? What are the ones that you feel are real critical priorities into moving the needle to create a better community? Once we have those 50 to 75, what we do is we break down the methodology behind each metric. We say, okay, this is how it was collected. This is the data that was used to create it. And it's 2017 data, let's say. We then go to local anchor institutions and say, hey, can you provide us this same metric, this same report, but can you do it on a monthly basis? And so we have this data relationship with folks like New Hanover Regional Medical Center, Wilmington Police Department, the Health Information Exchange, and a few others where we're basically going to download data on a monthly basis to create a real-time snapshot that's available to all. It's a publicly accessible database on those 50 to 75 metrics, and then continue to expand those metrics as we go. The next thing we're going to do is understanding the ecosystem. So we have a social impact analysis survey protocol that was approved by the IRB at UNCW, so we can use it for research. And we're going to go interview all 1,000 or so nonprofits in New Hanover County to understand where they work, who they work with, what does their patient or client population look like, how does their funding flows look, what kind of coalitions or task force are they a part of, and kind of try to really get a sense of how we're resourced to affect these symptoms. So we go after the metrics, those are the symptoms. How are we resourced to affect those symptoms? And oftentimes in social impact work, you can kind of point to some type of public health database or crime statistics or economic data, but very, very rarely are we able to say, not only here are the issues we're trying to face in a real-time manner, but also here's the ecosystem. Here's how we're organized to affect that. When you take that data and you take that ecosystem, you put those two things together and present them back to a community to start a conversation around, hey, what do we do now? And so that's where we're really trying to go. We're trying to set conditions to kind of provide this flashlight of data back to community leaders to say, here's what we think the data science is showing us, but this is the information we pulled for you. Tell us how we should use it. Tell us the direction we should go in. While all that's kind of happening over the next 6 months or so, we're working on things like equity, advocacy, and awareness. We've got our Equity 2020 campaign going with the arts sector. That'll kick off in March. We're doing our podcasts and our documentaries. You can check those out on our website, capefearcollective.org. And we're also doing partnership cultivation, special projects. So we have really fortunate to have a wide array of very close partners, particularly among anchor institutions and nonprofits in this community, and as well as the corporate sector. And so we're continuing those cultivations. We're also continuing to do certain projects here and there around building use cases and trying to understand kind of where the data fits into the broader community. So what's the future? I really look at us right now in 4 functional areas. And so the first one is collective analytics. So we covered a lot of that in the last slide around the data. But basically building a web-based platform that allows nonprofits and citizens and voters and politicians and whoever needs to use that data to access it and really present that data through an equitable lens. We're going to really leverage our partnership with the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, who's standing up an independent center under the Office of Community Engagement to support our work with faculty from across the colleges. The deans at UNCW have been incredibly supportive of us so far. And eventually we want to get to a place where we can take these large data sets and start to apply artificial intelligence and machine learning and starting to do some predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics around what works and what doesn't. The second area is collective voices. So you might have heard our podcast already. Again, if you haven't heard it, check it out. We're really trying to take a data point, right, out of that data collection effort, out of collective analytics, take a data point and speak to the lived experience behind that data point. This is important for a couple of reasons. You can see that quote at the bottom of that box, right? Statistics or graphs are not optimal to understand the experience of suffering. It's not only from an equity standpoint, but also from a very practical program implementation standpoint. I can't tell you how many times I've been in communities and said, hey, I took a look at this data, like, what do you think about that? And the folks who are living it every day, who are on those front lines, they'll look at me and say, yeah, I get that's what the data says, but let me tell you how it really plays itself out in the real world. And so if we're going to do interventions, we need both the data and we need the lived experience. And we're also using those two things to build a bit of a movement around equity, right? And particularly in Wilmington, North Carolina, where we have a really troubled history, particularly around racial equity, we have to kind of take those two things and really push them in a way that allows us to start to change the conversation, start to change the dynamics, start to change the level of equity in this community so we can start to kind of have a shared language as we project forward into the future. So once you have the data, you have the voice and the lived experience, now you're organizing for impact. So that's that collective impact methodology we talked about earlier. So this is kind of the action arm, right? So we show the data back to community partners and leaders, and we decide that we're going to go for cradle to career as an example, right? We staff those initiatives with program management and data scientists. We support it. We're not prescriptive. We're not there to make decisions. We're there to basically facilitate internally led discussions and steering committees made up of leaders in those sectors, and we're there to help them drive towards a goal that is agreed upon from across the community. We're already working on a few things. Again, we're kind of investigating different types of initiatives, whether that be a cradle to career or something more public health focused around food systems and diabetes that aligns with some of the things at the hospital. And we also partner with Community Care Lower Cape Fear, as well as the hospital on the North Carolina's Healthy Opportunities pilot program. And so that's a Medicaid program that will basically allow Medicaid to pay for things like housing, transportation, interpersonal violence interventions, and then hunger initiatives. So really taking a look at how to get farther upstream around the social determinants of health. And that pilot program is going to be in a 6-county region. So that's New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, Onslow, Bladen, and Columbus. And so we're really happy and proud and grateful to be on that application with NHRMC and Community Care, and we're hoping that that comes back through sometime this year. But finally, the fourth bucket is collective ventures. So, we work with the Center of Innovation at the hospital and private entrepreneurs like KWH Coin and some other companies around building this kind of social entrepreneurial incubator and investment fund. So a lot of social issues can be solved through private sector intervention, through small businesses, and particularly with a focus on ensuring that the opportunities for those small businesses as they solve social issues are really kind of equitably accessible by all people, particularly folks from the neighborhoods in which that intervention will support. And so this could be anything from transportation companies to a new app or some type of technology intervention that supports different types of social work, whether that be something around homelessness or could be something around the environment. So just kind of working through some of that. The other thing that we do is focused on is social impact investing. So right now we're working on a career impact bond package. So a career impact bond essentially is an investment vehicle to support folks going to job training at community colleges or UNCW or other types of trade training. And instead of a donation or a grant, it essentially turns it into a mechanism that is an investment. And so what that allows us to do is try to pull in different buckets of funding that weren't necessarily accessible to us when we're just looking for a donation. Rather, I can go to someone and ask for an investment, tell them they'll be able to get a return on that investment, and that will spur some additional capital injections into the workforce development space. Finally, the Social Innovation Lab. This is a work in progress for us, but really thinking about how we take social innovation and innovation in general and back it into a whole different a number of different types of age demographics. So Young Scientists Academy doing a lot of this work in middle schools. We just signed a partnership deal with District C, which is an innovative high school program based in Raleigh that does business consulting with 11th and 12th graders. We're looking at Code for Cape Fear, which is a kind of a offshoot of Code for America, where coders and technologists and developers who are in the workforce today can come together and do hackathons and things like that for the social sector. So whether that's putting up a Salesforce instance for a nonprofit or building a shared community data platform, and really leveraging every element we can get our hands on to drive this conversation and drive these initiatives. And so this is where I think we'll kind of end up, in varying degrees. But again, we're really waiting to see where the data says and what the community says in terms of which direction we go in. Certain things we want to move forward with, right? The data and the voices is something we believe in really heavily, but what collective impact looks like long term will really be dependent upon what the actual need is based on the data and kind of the view of the community in terms of what is needed and when. And so we kind of stand by to support that as we go. And then again, the ventures piece is really focused on some of that innovation element, but also driving revenue that's non-philanthropic. So how can we become, really decrease our dependency on donations through private enterprise? So taking a look at the logic model here, right? So you've got our core service areas. So again, I mentioned we're kind of in every sector, but in terms of the actual things we focus on, we're very specific about those service areas. So data science, project management, fundraising capacity, and advocacy and awareness. We tighten up around those issues, really kind of invest heavily in those particular service areas. And then we drive through this logic model around providing value to the social impact sector through shedding a light on efficient resource allocation, trying to get to predictive analytics, kind of demonstrating how we can organize for systemic interventions, and then, of course, the marketing and the storytelling, both for fundraising, but also for just awareness. So bringing the world into Wilmington and Wilmington out to the world. We scale those elements and scale that value across multiple sectors and multiple organizations. And then the hope is that we are able to do a return on investment for individual nonprofits and for the sector as a whole, but also a social return on investment. That's that SROI for the community. And so that's kind of how we see this flow through, right? We make these investments in the service areas, we bring value through that scale, and then we come back with an ROI and a social ROI that has a lasting effect. All right, so how does this look in practice? And so this is kind of a logic model meets org chart. But when I look at these core pillars here, these are collective impact initiatives. And again, these are just examples. We'll see where the data in the community leads us. But this is kind of the core of what we're trying to do. And I look at this as that new town square mentality. And some of you might have heard me mention that, but town squares in Wilmington and the surrounding areas haven't always been equitable. They haven't always been places where folks could come together to have honest conversations about making the world a better place. And so we think a lot about that when we're looking at our organizational structures and how we operationalize collective impact. And in that role, we really see ourselves as the gardener and not the gatekeeper. And so you can imagine getting to these collective impact initiatives, we're staffing them with program support, we're staffing them with those gardeners, but the decision making really sits with internally led steering committees made up of frontline experts and the folks who are living this every day, whether it's Cradle to Career or their affordable housing, and really allowing the community to drive the work forward. And we're more in a supportive role, again, around project management as well as data science. And so that gets us to the foundation. I mentioned data science, but collaboration, community engagement, trying to add additional fundraising capacity through partnerships and large-scale national grant making, and really try to kind of, again, set conditions on this garden and kind of cultivate this to be a successful initiative. We staff those elements out on the foundational side. And then when you have a setup like this, what it does is allows you to start to really operationalize certain longitudinal themes that may be more nuanced and more challenging when it comes to taking those things from idea to reality or kind of from a belief to an action. And so things like racial and gender equity, how do you operationalize those? How do you make sure that those best practices from around the world are infused into everything you do? You can do it from a values-based place, but also let's use a data example. We know that women are chronically underrepresented in public health data around the world. So can we have a mechanism in doing what we do with the data to ensure that there's an equitable representation by gender for all of these public health statistics? Same with racial equity. Are we constantly de-aggregating and kind of stratifying data in such a way that allows us to see racial gaps in services, allows us to see racial gaps in certain disease prevalences or public health events? And then again, up on the top left, we talked about our core service areas, really scaling those across this infrastructure. And what you get out the other end is, aligned outcomes-based agenda. All right, so think Cradle to Career, that spine, that continuum, all of our community agreeing that this is kind of the direction we're going and this is the role I play in that space. Community awareness, again, building a movement behind this. We can program all we want, but if the community doesn't really believe in some of these core foundational principles like equity, and they're not educated and kind of brought up to speed on what that looks like and how that plays out day in, day out, it's going to be really challenging to make true progress. And then finally, policy and advocacy. Policy has been a huge part of the system that's weighed down our most marginalized neighbors for decades and hundreds of years. And so when you have the access to data and you have access to large-scale project management for multiple entities on the front lines of social impact, when you have a robust media engine and storytelling engine, you can really start to have some pretty serious conversations around what policies matter and what are the effects of voting in certain policies and procedures and coding and zoning enforcements. How does that affect us downstream? And it's a very resource-intensive initiative in order to focus on those things, but it's incredibly important to move the needle long term. And so if we take this one layer deeper, you can see how this kind of starts to play itself out and how this infrastructure starts to set itself up for a more of a scaling effect. And so we broke out Cradle to Career a little bit more here. You can see potential champions on the Cradle side and potential champions on the career side. You can see some of the other programs or potential focus areas we could get into. Maybe we have to put a real focus on affordable housing for the next few years. That iterates itself, and then when we get to a certain point where we feel that operation is at steady state, we can kind of sunset that program and look to the next thing depending upon what the data in the community is telling us. On the right-hand side, we have some more specifics about some of these outputs. So that online data engine, of course, the 1 to 3 specific collective impact initiatives. We've got our podcast, our mixed media approach, the Art for Equity campaign kicking off here soon. And then, of course, the things around civic and government engagement, the policy assessments, voter registration and engagement. So this thing becomes this hub this vehicle for long-term systemic change. And again, it's an aggregator of the amazing work already occurring. It just provides that kind of scaffolding for all of that work to sit on and then scale rapidly through that shared consciousness and mutually reinforcing activities and those shared measurement platforms, and really drive towards that common agenda. All right, everyone, you made it. That concludes our presentation, our primer on the Cape Fear Collective and collective impact methodology. Thanks so much for sticking with us through the last hour or so. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments or want to get together, please hit us up at info@capefearcollective.org. You can also find us on the contact page on our website. But we're always eager to get out and get meetings and to meet people and to hear your wisdom, to get your feedback, to pick your brain about the work that you do and the work that we're trying to do. And we're really, hyper focused on learning and iterating and kind of adapting the more we know. Please check us out on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Also, check out our podcasts on our website, and they're also available each week wherever you get your podcasts, so Spotify, Apple, and Google. And again, we look forward to seeing you out there in the community. And if there's anything we can do to help you, please let us know.